They did not carry a flag into battle. They carried boot polish. Before a raid, the men of the 1st Special Service Force smeared their faces black, checked the edge of a knife built to punch through a steel helmet, and walked into the German lines without a sound. They killed in the dark, and left the living to find the dead at first light. The soldiers on the other side were some of the best Germany had: Panzer Grenadiers, paratroopers, hardened men who did not scare easily. And those men gave this unit a name. Not the Airborne, not the Rangers. A name that came straight out of fear: the Black Devils. Most people have never heard of them. Months before Germany learned to fear them, these were lumberjacks and forest rangers, hunters and trappers and prospectors, pulled out of the backwoods of the United States and Canada. The unit began as one of the strangest ideas of the entire war. It was activated on July 9, 1942, at Fort William Henry Harrison, just outside Helena, Montana. The plan that created it was codenamed Project Plow, dreamed up by an eccentric British inventor named Geoffrey Pike, who wanted commandos to ride specialized snow vehicles deep into occupied Norway and destroy the hydroelectric plants feeding the German war machine. The Norway mission was scrapped. The unit survived it. Command went to an American officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Tryon Frederick. There is an irony there worth sitting with. Frederick had written the report arguing the whole scheme was unworkable. Eisenhower read it and handed him the job of building the thing anyway. Frederick led from the front, always. He was the first man out the door on the unit's first parachute jump. Before the war ended, he would be wounded 8 times and pin 8 Purple Hearts and 2 Distinguished Service Crosses to a uniform he rarely kept clean. Half the force was American, half was Canadian. Roughly 1,800 fighting men in 3 small regiments, trained side by side until the line between the two countries simply disappeared. At Helena, they learned everything: to jump from aircraft, to blow bridges, to climb sheer rock, to ski, to fight in the water, and to use captured German weapons as easily as their own. The hand-to-hand killing was taught by a former Shanghai police detective named Pat O'Neill. The recruiters wanted men who could live in the cold and move in the dark. And that famous story, the one where the Americans were pulled out of prison cells, that is Hollywood invention. The real veterans hated it. Every man in the combat echelon carried the same blade, the V-42 stiletto. 7 inches of double-edged steel, ground to a needle point, with a groove for the thumb so the blade would slide flat between a man's ribs, and a sharpened metal skull on the pommel for the work the edge could not do. It could go through a steel helmet in a single thrust, the point sometimes lodged in bone. A knife built for one purpose, and one only. Everything they had learned was about to be tested, just not where anyone expected. Their first landing came on the island of Kiska, in the Aleutians, in August of 1943. They came ashore in rubber boats before dawn, braced for a slaughter, and found nothing. The Japanese garrison had slipped away in the fog days earlier. The force had trained for the better part of 2 years to kill, and had not fired a shot. Up to that point, the force was a promise. In the mountains of Italy, it became a weapon. By the winter of 1943, the Allied advance up the spine of Italy had stalled against a wall of German-held peaks. The worst of them was Monte la Difensa, Hill 960 on the maps, a fortress of sheer rock and dug-in German artillery guarding the road toward Cassino, and beyond it, Rome. There is a detail about that mountain most people never hear. The Allies had already thrown 2 infantry divisions against it. The British tried. The fighting dragged on for 10 days, and the artillery fire got so heavy that soldiers started calling the place the $1 Million Mountain. Nobody took it. The dead were left on the slopes where they fell. Fifth Army handed the mountain to the force and set aside 4 to 5 days to take it. On the freezing, rain-soaked night of December 2nd, 1943, about 600 men of the 2nd Regiment made an 11-hour march through the mud to the base of the one cliff the Germans were certain no one could climb. The final 1,000 feet rose at a pitch approaching 70 degrees. They went up it in the dark, in the rain, hand over hand on ropes. 2 scouts led the way. Sergeant Howard Van Osdale, part Cherokee, an old prospector his comrades rated the finest scout in the outfit, and Corporal Tommy Fenton of Montreal. Below them, hundreds of men clung to the wet rock and waited. Somewhere near the top, a boot knocked loose a slide of gravel. A German sentry called out into the black. Van Osdale shot him, and the mountain came apart. Private Kenneth Betts once described the instant a soldier meets combat for the first time. "You have 1 second," he said. "After that, in his words, you are either a seasoned veteran or a dead rookie." The fight on the summit was hand to hand. Grenades, fixed bayonets, the tearing sound of German machine guns firing at almost point-blank range. And in about 2 hours, the force took a peak that had cost the Allies weeks and thousands of men. They held it through 6 days of counterattacks, mortar fire, and the shriek of German rocket launchers. The Canadian battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McWilliam of New Brunswick, was killed by a mortar round while pushing toward the next ridge. When the force was finally relieved, the units that made the assault had taken a 77% casualty rate. The mountain was theirs. The cost was most of them. If the story had ended on that cliff, it would already belong in the history books. It didn't. Anzio, February 1944. The force reached the beachhead and took over a stretch of the line roughly a quarter of the entire perimeter, about the job of a full division. They held it for 99 days without relief, at times 40% below strength. And it was here that the legend was born. The ground between the two armies belonged to no one by daylight. At night, it belonged to the force. They blackened their faces with boot polish and burnt cork and crossed the canal into the German positions, moving without a sound. They killed sentries with the V-42. They took prisoners. They stole boots and equipment off men who never woke and slipped back before dawn. But here is the detail that turned a raiding unit into something the Germans would never forget. Frederick had cards printed, stamped with the unit's red spearhead and a single line in German. Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The worst is yet to come. His men left them on the bodies of the German dead and pinned them to abandoned positions so that the survivors would find them at sunrise and understand that the men who had done this had walked among them in the night. The stories grew from there. That they cut the throats of sleeping men and left the one beside them alive to wake up next to a corpse. How much of that is literally true, and how much grew in the retelling, no one can fully confirm, and the force never worked very hard to correct it. Fear was the weapon, and the fear did work the guns could not. The Germans started calling them Die Schwarzen Teufel, the Black Devils. A line is said to have been found in a diary taken from a dead German officer that told the same story, that the Black Devils were all around them and they never heard them coming. That exact wording has never been verified, but the fear behind it was real enough to write down. A captured German order told troops at Anzio exactly who they were facing.
It called them treacherous, unmerciful, and clever. It warned that no man could afford to relax, and it promised 10 days of leave to any soldier who managed to capture just one of them. If you want the real history underneath the legends, the version most documentaries skip, this channel goes deep on exactly these units. Consider subscribing before we go on. Because one man at Anzio turned that kind of nerve into a legend all his own. Sergeant Thomas George Prince, Tommy Prince, an Ojibwe soldier from Broken Head, Manitoba, a descendant of Chief Peguis, and the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. He served in the Canadian Battalion of the Force, and he moved through the dark in moccasins so that he made no sound at all. On the 8th of February 1944, near the town of Latoria, Prince ran some 1,400 meters of telephone wire out to an abandoned farmhouse. The house sat barely 200 meters from a German artillery position. From inside it, Prince watched the German guns and reported everything he saw back down the line for nearly a full day. And this is where his story takes a turn that sounds invented. When shelling cut the wire, Prince pulled on a farmer's clothes, walked out into the field in plain sight of the Germans, and began tending the crops. He found the break, knelt down as if to tie his bootlace, and repaired the line right there while the enemy watched what they took for a peasant working his land. Then he stood and shook his fist at both sides, playing the part to the end. His information helped destroy 4 German gun positions. For it, he received the military medal, pinned on his chest by King George VI at Buckingham Palace. The force fought on after Anzio, into Rome, first of all the Allied units to secure its way into the city on the 4th of June, 1944, where Frederick was hit 3 separate times in a single day. Then into southern France that August. And then, in the cold at the very end of the year, it was gone. The 1st Special Service Force was disbanded on December 5, 1944, near Menton, on the French-Italian border. When the order came for the Canadians to fall out and return to their own army, men who had scaled cliffs and crossed no man's land in the dark stood in formation and wept. In 251 days of combat, this 1,800-man unit accounted for roughly 12,000 German casualties and captured some 7,000 prisoners. Its own attrition ran past 600%. For every man it lost, it inflicted a toll on the enemy that almost no unit of the war could match, and its bloodline runs straight into the present. The American Green Berets and Canada's Special Forces both trace their origins back to the force. The knife on the United States Special Forces crest is the V-42. Every December 5th, the men who came after still gather to remember them. In February of 2015, on the 3rd of the month, the last surviving forceman received the Congressional Gold Medal in the United States Capitol. Around 40 of them were still alive to see it. As for Tommy Prince, the ghost who fixed the wire in a farmer's clothes, the war did not repay him. He came home to a country that offered him very little. He served again in Korea, then slid into illness and poverty, and died in a veterans' home in Winnipeg in 1977 at 62 years old. A guard of honor from his old regiment carried his coffin. The men who terrified the finest soldiers in the German army were, in the end, ordinary men from small towns on 2 sides of a border. They did something almost no one believed could be done, and then most of the world forgot they were ever there. Now you know that they were.